I was 38 years old when my life fell apart in ways both silent and irreversible. I suppose if you ask the world, they'd say I had everything: a stable finance job in New York City, a wife named Emily who had been my college sweetheart, and the picture-perfect apartment tucked between bustling coffee shops and tree-lined Brooklyn streets. But the truth about life is that it rarely unravels in spectacular crashes. More often, it fades away in quiet whispers, in words left unsaid, in spaces we never knew we were creating. Emily was gone before I ever realized she had left. Not in the dramatic sense, you know, no slammed doors on a stormy night, no fight that ended with one of us storming out. Instead, she had booked a vacation. Alone. "It'll be good for me," she had said with her gentle smile. "Just some space. You understand, right?" I had nodded at the time because what else do you do? You say yes, you pretend to understand, even as something hollow begins echoing in your chest. I convinced myself she'd come back with souvenirs, with stories about sandy beaches and sunsets. But deep inside, I think I knew. That vacation, that space, was not just a trip. It was her farewell. It was a Tuesday morning when I watched her wheel her navy blue suitcase out of our apartment. The suitcase rattled against the hardwood floor as though protesting whatever unspoken truth was driving her away. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, the kind of kiss you give someone out of habit, not passion. "Take care of yourself, Danny," she whispered, and then the door closed behind her. For weeks afterward, I clung to the idea that she'd return. I told myself she needed time away from me, from us, from the suffocating rhythm of our daily lives. I filled the apartment with distractions: sports on TV, stacked books I never opened, takeout containers covering the kitchen table. But deep down I realized she wasn't coming back. You can't ask for space unless something's already broken. Emily never told me outright. That was her way. She'd never been one for confrontation. When my father died 3 years ago and I wept in the parking lot after the funeral, she simply held my hand, saying nothing. That was love to her, quiet presence. And now, ironically, it was goodbye in that same silence. A postcard came 2 months after she left. It was from Santa Fe, New Mexico. A watercolor sunset brushed over red desert rocks with a handwritten note on the back. "Danny, I hope this space helps us both breathe. Please understand. Love, E." I must have read those words 1,000 times. What did she mean by helps us both? Helps us do what? End? Begin? Her refusal to use final words left me stranded between hope and despair. And isn't that the cruelest part? A clean break hurts, yes, but it at least offers clarity. What she gave me instead was limbo. It wasn't until I found her sweater, an old gray one tucked in the closet, that I finally cried. The fabric smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender and something crisp, like pine. I pressed it against my face and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. And in the wreckage of that breakdown, a small truth emerged: if she had already begun her journey of letting go, then I had to begin mine too. But where does a man begin? At 38, I had built a life that suddenly felt meaningless. The apartment was a mausoleum filled with relics of a marriage. Every object reminded me of her absence: the ceramic mugs we picked together in Portland, the Polaroid stuck on the fridge with magnetic letters, even the silence of the room at night, where her laughter no longer echoed. So, I left. Not in a dramatic rush. I simply decided one morning that healing would never find me if I stayed in that same old space. I typed a resignation letter to my firm, stuffed essentials into a backpack, and booked a one-way ticket west. If Emily had sought her healing in desert skies, maybe I could at least seek mine somewhere unknown. America is vast, endlessly stretching, each highway a string pulling you toward the horizon. My journey began in Denver, Colorado. The thin chill of mountain air pressed against my lungs as I walked through streets of art galleries and coffee shops. For the first time in months, I didn't feel suffocated by the cage of memory. I rented a dull gray SUV and drove aimlessly south. The mountains faded into open plains where golden grass swayed beneath the endless sky. At gas stations, I'd watch families laugh as they bought sodas and bags of chips, and I wondered what they'd think if they knew the truth, that I was a man set adrift, chasing pieces of himself scattered like dust. Somewhere near the border to New Mexico, I pulled over and stood by the roadside, staring at the sunset. The sky burned orange and crimson, as if the universe itself were on fire. And then, it struck me, maybe Emily had stood under this very sky a few weeks earlier, breathing in this very evening light. For a moment, it felt as though I had met her again, not as husband and wife, but as two travelers passing each other briefly beneath the same canopy of sky. It was in Santa Fe that I met her, not Emily, but a stranger who would mirror my own grief in unexpected ways. Her name was Claire. She was sitting outside a cafe, sketching in a notebook, her dark hair tied messily in a bun. I noticed her eyes first. They carried a weight, the kind you don't get from stress or exhaustion but from loss. "Do you mind if I sit here?" I asked, pointing to the empty chair at her table. She glanced up, studied me as though I were a puzzle piece she wasn't sure fit, then nodded. We didn't trade life stories immediately. Instead, we exchanged small bits of humanity, comments about the pastry she was eating, the way the wind carried desert dust into the air. But grief recognizes grief. Eventually, she asked, "So, what brought you here?" I hesitated, then shrugged. "Let's just say I'm figuring out how to be alone." She didn't pry. She simply nodded as though she understood perfectly. Later that evening, over cups of strong coffee, she admitted her husband had died in a car accident the year before. Silence fell between us, heavy yet sacred. And for the first time since Emily left, I felt like someone wasn't just listening, but truly hearing. The next day, Claire and I walked through Santa Fe's art district together. She carried her sketchbook while I carried my silence. The adobe walls glowed under the afternoon sun, earthy and timeless, like they had watched centuries of wandering souls pass through. "Funny, isn't it?" she said, pausing at a gallery window filled with clay sculptures. "How people are always trying to leave a mark, to be remembered. But in the end, time just swallows everything." I studied her profile, the sadness in her voice. "I think sometimes it's not about being remembered forever. It's about existing long enough for someone to feel less alone." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Maybe that's enough." I didn't know it then, but that day would change the entire course of my healing. Claire wasn't Emily. She wasn't meant to replace her or erase her. But sometimes strangers appear in our lives at exactly the right moment, carrying the unspoken permission we need to start over. We spent the next week together, not as lovers or even close friends at first, but as two drifters who found solace in walking the same path. We drove out into the desert one morning, following a trail that wound between red canyons. The silence of the desert is different, expansive, consuming, like a mirror forcing you to listen to yourself. At one point we reached a cliff overlook. Wind tugged at our clothes while the horizon spread endlessly before us, the land unshaken by our sorrows. Claire opened her sketchbook and began tracing the ridges of the canyons. I sat beside her, tracing my thoughts instead. "You know," I said finally, "Emily never told me directly she was leaving. She just said she needed space. Took a vacation alone. That was her goodbye." Claire set her pencil down, her gaze sharp with understanding. "That's worse in a way. At least with death you know it's final. But when someone gives you silence instead of truth, you're forced to wrestle with ghosts." Her words hit me hard, like thunder rolling across the horizon. I had been chasing Emily's silence for months, asking questions she'd never answer. Maybe the desert was telling me what I needed to hear: stop expecting closure where none exists. That night, back in town, Claire and I sat outside near a fire pit behind a small inn. The flames danced wildly, crackling, sending sparks into the dark sky. She sipped beer from a bottle while I leaned back, feeling the weight of unshed words pressing against me. "Can I confess something?" I asked. She tilted her head. "Sure." I keep imagining Emily walking back into my life. Like, any minute she'll text me. Or she'll come home and say, "I'm sorry, let's start again." I know it won't happen, but my voice faltered. I don't know how to live without that illusion. Claire stared into the fire before answering softly, "I know that illusion." For months after the accident, I'd imagine I heard his keys jingling at the door. Or his laugh in the other room. The mind clings to what it's not ready to lose. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It just means learning to carry the weight differently. Her words were a lifeline I hadn't known I needed. Strange how a woman I met by chance in a cafe was helping me untangle the knots that years of love and silence had left behind. Eventually, Claire and I had to part ways. She had her own path. She was traveling across the Southwest to paint landscapes, a self-driven pilgrimage of rebuilding her art and her spirit. The morning she left, she handed me one of her sketches, a drawing of that canyon overlook where we'd sat together, the lines deep and raw. "So you'll remember not the pain," she said, "but the moment you realized you're still here." She hugged me, warm but brief, like someone sending off a comrade on another trail. Then she was gone, her small hatchback disappearing down the highway. I stood in the motel parking lot for a long while, holding her sketch, realizing that small moments of connection with someone else's truth can shift your entire course. I drove west to Arizona, the desert turning harsher, the mountains jagged. In Sedona, I hiked crimson rocks that seemed painted by the gods, the air vibrating with stillness. I meditated above a valley, breathing as though rediscovering how lungs were meant to work. In the past, Emily and I had always filled silence with chatter. But here, I discovered that silence could also be honest. It could cradle you rather than abandon you. From Arizona, the road pulled me into California. The Pacific spread out like an endless mirror, vast, violent, and forgiving all at once. I stood on the cliffs of Big Sur one evening, watching waves slam against rocks with relentless force. For the first time since Emily left, I whispered, "Goodbye." And the ocean roared back, not in return, but in affirmation. Late one night in San Francisco, I sat in a rented room, staring at a blank sheet of paper. I realized there were words inside me that Emily would never hear, and maybe wasn't meant to. Words like, "I'm angry you chose silence. I'm broken from the absence you created. I'm learning to forgive you and myself." So, I wrote her a letter. Not to send, but to release. Emily. You left in the quietest way possible, but your absence shouted through every corner of me. I kept waiting for you to return, but tonight, I stopped waiting. This letter will never reach you, yet I think that's the point. Saying goodbye isn't for you anymore. It's for me. Wherever you are, I hope you've found peace. And slowly, I will find mine too. Danny. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and the next morning stood at the Golden Gate Bridge. With the bay winds rushing around me, I let the envelope fall into the water. Watching it drift away was terrifying and freeing at once, like unclenching my fist after years of holding on too tight. Days melted into weeks. My journey turned less about escaping Emily, more about embracing myself. I volunteered briefly at a shelter in Oakland, fixing meals for homeless veterans. Listening to their stories of war, addiction, and recovery taught me that grief doesn't end, it transforms. We adapt, we reshape, we keep moving. I began sketching my own moments in a small notebook, not with an artist's hand but with a traveler's heart, the canyon overlook, the desert winds, the ocean's rage. They were my breadcrumbs back to life. And slowly, I began to breathe differently. Not shallow breaths filled with fear she might call or she might not. But deep breaths carrying the acceptance that the story of Emily and me had ended, and a new story, mine, had begun. 6 months had passed since the day I watched Emily roll her suitcase out of our apartment. In that time, I had crossed deserts, climbed cliffs, stood by the ocean, and met strangers who left fingerprints on my soul. Yet, there came a day when I felt the pull of the East again, the city I had abandoned, the life I had left suspended in silence. The flight back to New York was unsettling. As the plane touched down, the skyline stretched out like a proclamation, here's where you must face yourself. The first night, I returned to our old Brooklyn apartment. The landlord had been holding it for me, a courtesy after years of knowing us as a couple. But the place no longer felt like mine. Dust had settled in corners, photographs still clung to the fridge, and Emily's sweater, yes, that gray one, hung quietly in the closet. I thought it would break me again. Instead, I only felt acceptance. This was once a chapter of my life. But it didn't own me anymore. I sat down in the dim light of our kitchen, fixed 2 cups of coffee out of habit, and placed one across from me, her seat. For the first time, I let myself speak to the empty chair without shame. You were my beginning in so many ways. But I can't keep waiting for you to be my middle and end. I sat in silence afterward, half expecting her ghost to answer, half relieved it never did. That was my goodbye, not whispered to a postcard or thrown across an ocean, but to the lingering shadows inside me. In the weeks that followed, I began piecing life back together. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gently, like stitching a torn fabric thread by thread. I picked up freelance financial advising instead of running back to the corporate world. The stress suits and endless boardrooms no longer felt like me. Instead, I worked with small local businesses, cafes, bookstores, struggling family shops, helping them stay afloat. Real people, real stories. It gave me purpose. On Saturdays, I visited Prospect Park. Sometimes I sat with my notebook, sketching crudely drawn trees or writing fragments of thoughts. Once, a child laughed at my terrible sketch of a bird. Instead of embarrassment, I laughed along. Healing, I realized, was finding joy in imperfection again. One chilly October afternoon, I stopped at a new gallery in Manhattan, curious about an exhibit of southwestern landscapes. As I walked through, a familiar stroke on a canvas caught my breath. Broad lines, raw shading, Claire's art. I stood before a large piece, a red canyon under an exploding sunset sky, realization washing over me like recognition of an old friend. Beautiful, isn't it? A voice said behind me. I turned, it was Claire herself. A year older, perhaps, but carrying that same gentle gravity in her eyes. Claire, I whispered, almost unable to believe it. We laughed like people reunited after lifetimes, awkward yet warm. Over coffee afterward, she told me about her travels, her art shows, the slow way she had learned to live again. I told her my own journey, how the desert and the sea had broken me open, only to let me breathe differently. She didn't stay in New York long, her path remained her own. But that evening was not about rekindling or rewriting destinies. It was about witnessing how both of us, broken by different kinds of loss, had stitched our lives back with new threads. 2 paths once intersected in Santa Fe, and here, for one fleeting night, they crossed again. That was enough. As autumn deepened into winter, I found myself embracing routines that weren't haunted by absence. I cooked for myself, not just rushed dinners, but real recipes. I invited colleagues over for wine. I even signed up for a meditation group, something I had once dismissed as not my thing. Each of these small choices wasn't about erasing Emily. They were about rediscovering Daniel. One evening in December, after the group session, I walked through the streets of Brooklyn covered in holiday lights. For the first time in years, I felt awe at the simple beauty of strangers bustling past, at families holding hands, at the city humming with life. Grief hadn't left me. But it had changed its shape. It no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a scar. And scars, I realized, are proof not just of injury, but of healing. I began writing, at first in scattered journal entries, then in longer reflections. Words spilled out faster than I could manage. I wrote about Emily, about silence, about Claire, about deserts and oceans and cities that saved me without knowing it. Eventually, a thought occurred, maybe my story could help someone else. Maybe someone, somewhere, stuck in limbo after a quiet goodbye, could read these words and know they weren't alone. So I started shaping my story into a memoir. It wasn't about bitterness or tragedy, it was about transformation. About learning that closure isn't given by others, it's something you build with your own hands. One snowy evening, I took Emily's sweater, the lavender and pine-scented one, and carried it to the Brooklyn Bridge. Standing above the East River, I held it against my chest one last time. You mattered. You will always matter, I whispered. But our book is closed. I didn't throw it into the water. That wasn't who we were. Instead, I folded it gently, walked into a local donation center, and placed it in the box. Somewhere, someone would wear it again, not knowing the history stitched in its threads. And that felt right. Emily's sweater, like our love, deserved another life. That night, lying in bed, I slept without restless dreams for the first time since she left. Months later, I stood in a small Brooklyn bookstore where my memoir draft was being read aloud at a local writers' gathering. Hearing my own words spoken by someone else was surreal. The pain I once thought would drown me had turned into sentences, and those sentences had turned into bridges toward others' hearts. After the reading, a young woman approached me. She said softly, "My fiancé left me without saying a word. Reading your work made me feel like I can survive this." Her eyes shone with gratitude I recognized instantly, the gratitude of the grieving when they realize they are not abandoned. In that moment, I knew my journey wasn't about losing Emily. It was about finding myself, and maybe even helping others find themselves too. When Emily first walked out, I hated the word space. It felt like cruelty disguised as kindness, like cowardice painted as gentleness. But years later, I see now what she really gave me. Space is not the absence of love, it's the room to grow beyond it. Her quiet goodbye had forced me to seek deserts, oceans, strangers, sketchbooks, fire pits, and city streets that would, piece by piece, break and rebuild me. Today, when I wake up, I don't wait for her footsteps by the door or her perfume on the wind. I wake up and breathe, fully present in the life I've built. The space remains. But it's no longer a void. It's a horizon. And if you asked me who I am now, I'd simply say, my name is Daniel Carter. Once, I loved and lost a woman named Emily. Today, I am still traveling, not across states anymore, but across the landscapes of myself. And that is enough.